So I want you to think about this panel this morning as the opening news report for the conference, and kind of what's the state of the state or the world, and some of the things going on in disability studies and faith and inclusive ministries and some of the issues and areas that are in this. We've got a very distinguished group up here. We don't have a lot of time. We're going to try to keep this moving along, but just to give you a taste of some of the things that people who are leaders and people who've been working in this area are working on and thinking about. I'd like to introduce from the over to the far side over here, to the far left. That doesn't mean that that's where he is politically, although he is from Scotland. John Swinton from the UK, Erik from the Kennedy Center in Vanderbilt, Benjamin Connor from Western Theological Seminary, Hans Reinders from the Netherlands, Rabbi Ruti Regan, here for us today representing Jewish voices in this discussion, and recent graduate of Jewish Seminary in New York and running her own organization and doing training in all kinds of areas. Theology and disability and Judaism. Ben Rhodes from Johnny and Friends in California, and Neil Cudney from Canada, from Christian Horizons in Toronto. So what I'd like each of you to do, just very briefly, is to say something about the context in which you work and some of the kind of current things that you're working on. Just to give people an idea of what you're coming out of, what you're bringing with you as you come here today. You're going to have a chance to hear many of these folks this afternoon and me in longer workshops. So let's just start. Let me just start with Ben. And we're going to go. I want to move this around. We're not going to play it up and down like a row. Turn that on.
How's that? Yeah. All right. So I'm at Western Theological Seminary, and there we have a graduate certificate in disability and ministry that can be done completely through distance learning. So that's one of the exciting things going on at Western. It's the only thing that's kind. We also received a big grant there to do what I'm calling disable theological education. To disable theological education. That's to remove ableist biases. And so we have part of that money created positions that we're calling Nouwen Fellows, honoring the legacy of Henry Nouwen. And we have two folks who are coming to work on this intersection of disability and theology who are going to be with us for a couple years. Just finished a book. Well, the book just finally got published by University Press Academic on the intersection of disability and mission. So it's the first book that looks at that intersection of disability and missiology, called Disabling Mission, Enabling Witness. That's what it's called. And I also do a lot of work with youth ministry, which will be something I'll talk about later when you ask what are some of these edges we can push into on adolescence as a social construct that is disabling. So I'll leave you with that.
Okay, somebody? Ruti?
Sure. So I'm Rabbi Ruti Regan, and I say that I, in some sense, represent two spiritual traditions, both Judaism and the disability rights community, which uses secular language more and is, has a certain complicated relationship with these things. But one way I put it is that the Torah told me we're all created in God's image. The disability rights community taught me how to mean it, especially ADAPT and the autistic community. And so I work in some contexts in which I use more secular language. One of them is my blog, realsocialskills.org, in which I got tired of social skills being a slur for making disabled people not other people, and reclaimed it by taking it literally. And in the Jewish community, I work in disability theology and also outreach writ large. I teach Torah on Twitter, and I also am working on in inclusive Jewish education and disability commentary on the Haggadah, and I teach rabbis and cantors disability-informed spiritual leadership skills and that kind of thing.
I come at it from a slightly different angle. I'm part of a social service agency, a Christian social service agency in Canada. We employ about 4,000 folks and support 2,800 individuals across Ontario, Saskatchewan, and about 7 countries around the world. Our interest in this conversation started right at the beginning of the Summer Institute, as a Christian faith-based organization, we were beginning to think about what it meant for us to be a faith-based agency in the services and the supports that we offered. It really began kind of a deconstruction process for us as we began to rethink even the very foundation of how, why, and what kinds of things and supports that we offer. At the beginning of the conversation, I have a couple of my colleagues here. At the beginning of the conversation 9 years ago, a lot of my peers were kind of sitting around the table going, why are we involved in a theological conversation? But over this past 9 years, it has, the conversations here, the learning here, and the contributions that we've been able to bring have had a significant impact on our entire organization and how we think and how it is that we engage the faith components and the spirituality of the people that we support. We've got a long way to go, and so we're committed to this conversation ongoingly. I just want to encourage any that are here from a social service agency perspective that these conversations are very powerful and significant in shaping who, how, and what you are as a ministry.
Hans, you got the mic?
As a retired professor, retired from university, one of the perks is that you can choose what you do. The flip side of that is you cannot blame nobody else for doing what you do. Having said that, I spent much of my time together with my wife Lydia on the Quality of Supports project in the Netherlands, in which we are trying to find ways to change understanding of quality of supports, primarily as a learning process for direct support staff. I love one-liners, and one of my favorites is, if you don't have the people who are actually capable of delivering supports, the rest is just paper. So there is a heavy focus on learning process with regard to quality of supports as something that is much more subject of discovery, something that you need to discover what actually quality of support for a particular person is, rather than outcome-driven conceptions demarcated by systems and instruments of control. Having said that, with regard to the workshop this afternoon, one of the things that you discover is how many sound initiatives in trying to develop person-oriented supports are actually shipwrecked and run against systemic things. And one of the questions is, what's the explanation for that? And are there signs of hope that things might change? But that's for the afternoon.
Good morning. You probably noticed that Hans has an accent. I don't have an accent. You guys clearly do. So I'm hoping that you can understand me. So I'll speak very slowly, very carefully. And I work at the University of Aberdeen, which is in Scotland, in the United Kingdom. And there's probably 3 things that you might find interesting that are going on within Aberdeen just now. The first is we are just beginning a new Friendship House initiative. So Ben at Western has been working on this for many years. The Western have a really well-established Friendship House. But we're beginning to develop our own version of Friendship House, where we're creating an intentional community within the university where people with intellectual disabilities and the students can get together to open up the possibility of friendship, and for people with intellectual disabilities to participate in the curriculum, to participate in local church activity and various other things. So we're in the early stages. Topher Andres, who's the only man here that has a bow tie on, he's one of the students that's at the beginning of forming this community. So if you see him with his bow tie, you could ask him some questions about that. The second initiative is an initiative that's been put forward or run by my colleague in New Testament, Grant McCaskill. He's a professor in New Testament at Aberdeen. Now, Grant has, for a number of reasons, has a great interest in autism. And he's just formed a new Centre for Autism and Christian Community, which will be both a combination of research and practice and engagement with various issues, people and agencies. And so that's just beginning, so he's in the formative stages of that, but it's a really interesting opportunity to begin to bring the experience of autism into the theological context and begin to think through what that looks like. And then the third thing, which you might find interesting, is in relation to some work I'm doing just now on mental health. So I used to be a mental health nurse many years ago, and mental health has been something that's very, been central to my formation really in many ways. And so recently I've been working on a project trying to understand what it's like for Christians to experience three major conditions: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression. And trying to put to one side your general assumptions about what these diagnoses should be or what they should look like, and begin to listen to the voices of people as they articulate what it's like to live with that and what it's like to experience God in these different types of contexts. So that's three things that are happening with us just now, which I think may be interesting for people.
So I work for an organization called Johnny and Friends, which some of you may have heard of. We do a lot of things, but primarily we work with the Christian faith community to help equip them and prepare them to evangelize and disciple people affected by disabilities, which is part of the normal life of the church. But it turns out some people don't think that. So it's an opportunity to change the way people think about what church looks like. So I've been coming to the Summer Institute for a number of years now. And I work in the kind of academic arm, Christian Institute on Disability. And so we're engaged in partnerships with a number of seminaries and universities around the world to help raise the profile and the need for theological and pastoral education that includes intentionally and explicitly thinking about people with disabilities from the beginning, not as a sort of optional add-on once you get big enough or have enough money. And I've spent a lot of time traveling internationally teaching, and it's amazing to me how consistent the stories are across the board, even though there are different cultural experiences. But people with disabilities are typically marginalized and stigmatized in ways that are often very unconscious. So we partner with a lot of different organizations to help bring about those changes, and it's been exciting to be part of the Summer Institute to see its growth in terms of number of people and in the breadth of perception that changes are happening very slowly, often more slowly than I would like. But I think we're beginning to see changes happen, whether it's at a Western Theological Seminary where people are excited about a new program, seeing what Christian Rights has done around the world and seeing opportunities that are springing up. So I'd encourage you, as you spend time here, there's a core group of people that you're going to see in a lot of different places. We're all engaged in a very similar project. So spend some time over lunch and dinner and you'll see these people again.
And I come by way of Nashville, Tennessee. I'm a professor in the field of special education at Vanderbilt University. Primarily do intervention work in schools and workplaces and also in congregations. And the two areas that have captivated my attention lately, the first actually has emerged from some conversations we had at the Institute several years ago on the topic of belonging, and belonging as being something that's beyond inclusion, that there's something different between being present and having a presence in a place. And so for me, as someone who works closely with congregations and agencies, trying to figure out what does it look like to live out practices that lead to belonging for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in their congregations. So what does that look like to move in ways that lead to that experience of relationships and being known and being valued and befriended and being loved in ways that lead to belonging? So that's been a focus of mine. That'll be the workshop that I do this afternoon, is what we've been learning from that work with families and individuals about the movements we might make. And the second's related to that, as more and more congregations are stepping into this space and into these conversations. They're really wondering, how do we move forward? What do we do next? And so we've been trying to develop some reflection processes that can be used by congregations that feel overwhelmed by all the options of ministry that they hear about, or feel stuck about knowing that they ought to do something but don't know what that ought to be. So we've been developing some process at the local congregational level of how do we figure out what we're doing really well and what's our next best steps in this area. But more exciting for me has been thinking about the community as the focus. So how do we get a community to move together? The network of congregations and agencies that care about people with disabilities at the level of a city or a town, how do we get them to come together collectively to address not just what's happening on Sunday morning or Saturday, but to think about sort of the rest of the 6 days of the week and how they collectively can help people with disabilities flourish.
All right, thanks, guys. All right, and Ruti, we happen to have a group up here this morning, and somebody said, "Oh, it's going to be all guys," mostly except for Rabbi Ruti Regan, which
You get to be so many cookies today. It's great.
There you know why I invited Ruti Regan. But you all also, you're doing your own work in your own context, and there are you get to see things that are happening. And there's been, I think, a lot of us would think there's been kind of this growing tide of resources and ministries and different kinds of things happening at the multiple intersections of faith and disability. What are some of the ones besides what you're doing that you think are the most exciting? And where do you think some of this comes from? And jump in. A Baptist would say, as the Spirit moves you.
Well, I'll start where I think some of it's coming from. I think it's interesting. I've been sort of reading back through our literature over the last 40 or 50 years of folks who've been writing about these issues. And it's interesting, over the last about 10 years, the question has switched from why to how. I think why ought we be moving in this space to how do we proceed? And so I think part of the explosion of resources has been to equip people who, moving from having to convince them to do ministry in this space to equipping them to figure out what that looks like. I think the other thing that we're seeing is we've now had 2 generations of people who've grown up going to schools that are inclusive or at least integrated, and are now saying, why not in our congregations as well? So I think that's spurring some of the movements. The things that excite me are some micro level things. We're just seeing all across this country these sort of localized efforts to stitch together different congregational movements and draw attention to these issues. Those are sometimes called faith inclusion networks, and they're sort of beginning to emerge all across the country of people who are collectively saying, how do we change the spiritual landscape so that people with disabilities are supported to be included and to belong. And we're also seeing, I'm excited about just the small ways conversations about these topics are penetrating the ordinary venues that church leaders begin to read. We're seeing lead and feature issues, articles in major magazines, denominational magazines that you never would have seen before. The latest issue of Christianity Today and a few others, for example. So beginning to see the conversation move to where congregational leaders will actually hear about this.
So similar to what Erik was saying, I think that, I don't know whether you call it an inflection point or a generational change or a demographic shift, but it seems like in the last 10 or 15 years that it used to be a conference like this, 10 years ago you'd have more people on stage than you would in the audience, and now there's more interest. So in the space where I work, 6 years ago when I started working at Johnny and Friends, you'd have to sell an opportunity or keep repeatedly asking at a seminary or a university to include some kind of educational component with something to do with disability, whether it's disability ministry or disability theology. And now, in the last 3 weeks, I had 4 or 5 conversations with different universities that are starting either organically because someone in their faculty or someone on their staff had a personal interest, or that's become a professional space. And that's interesting because if you start changing the way people are educated, you have knock-on effects, because that's going to change in the next generation, where the presumption is why wouldn't you have some kind of disability ministry in your congregation? And I think that changes the conversation, not just from why to how, but the presumption is now why not. And that's still, I think, a long ways off, but I think in the next, the next generation or two, we'll see that be the more default, which is, as far as I can tell, new.
Two things. When I started into this particular work 15 years ago, and to see the significant change in conversation, there's two things that I think have been driving that as well. One of those is families are asking different questions. The last institution for persons with disabilities closed in Ontario about a decade ago. So families coming into the services and supports that they are looking for are much different, and they're asking much different questions and needing much different things. And I think that's driving some of the conversation that we're trying to explore in some different ways. The other thing is 2005 in Ontario saw the OADA come into effect, which is very similar to the AADA here. Where, along with what Ben was saying, that beginning this work, calling churches and just begging and trying to find some kind of opportunity and some kind of doorway to go in and have this conversation. The phone calls and the inquiries are starting to come to us. One of that is families are becoming much more active and engaged and forceful in the conversation. But the other thing is that they're coming, the church communities are coming to us as a response to the AODA and having to comply with legislation. But this has opened up a conversation for us that has been really growing, and we're increasingly in church conversations and Christian universities and seminaries as well, as we're talking about the work that they're doing and the response that they have to persons with disabilities and their families is not because of a sociological mandate or legislation, but it's a response to a theological injunction. It's trying to get that conversation switched around from one of being fear of reprisal because of not meeting legislation and having to comply with that minimal thing that we need to do to comply, to switching that conversation completely and helping and engaging that conversation, that this is at the very core of the gospel itself, of what it means to be a community of belonging for all people. And so shifting, and one of the very important conversations, I've listened to all of them, but one from Hans in particular, one of the very early, that settled in my mind he challenged us not to think of this as a theology of disability, but building an anthropological theology that included those with disabilities, if I understood it right. And so moving that conversation from from being a very specialized conversation that if you happen to have a brother or a sister or somebody that is impacted by disability, that this is a conversation at the core of it, as we are wrestling with what it means to be in relationship to God, what it means to be known by God, what it means to know God, what it means to be community together. And so those are two of the things that I'm seeing that's driving some of this conversation as well.
Can I follow up?
Yeah, go ahead.
I follow up on Neil on this because I think over the last couple of years I've been drawing to the opposite of what you're describing. Not in the sense that I do not agree that you're very right in thinking about what is ultimately the driving motivation behind the kind of work that we're thinking about and that you are a leader of. But the question that occupies my mind is, how is it that this motivational drive, whether it's Christian, spiritual, or whatever label you want to put on it, how is it that it is so often frustrated by the systemic ways that supports are organized? And in that regard, and I do not have to tell you this, it is very often the case all over the Western world that also faith-based organizations are very much limited by state regulations and laws and rules, such that quite often you see that what they aim at achieving gets frustrated by the very fact of the rules and regulations they need to respond to.
Can I point out that I might have slightly less of a problem with that than you do?
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, is this good? I think that Christianity is not universal, and sometimes when I'm in conversation with Christian faith leaders who want to talk about disability, I feel like Christians see us as an unconditionally available mission field, that if there are just fewer barriers, we'd all be Christians. And, I believe in religious freedom. If somebody wants to be a Christian, that's their business. And Christianity is not universal, and there being some barriers to evangelizing disabled people you have power over, I think is not a bad thing.
I must not have expressed myself very clearly, because the issue that I'm thinking about is not whether organizations are enabled to express their faith in any way or form. What I'm concerned about, whether they're able of providing good supports in terms of the people who are receiving the reports and the supports. And very often that is not the case. And so what I'm trying to understand and argue with people responsible both in the roles of health insurers and policy developers is, why is it that your intentions of making it possible that agencies provide good care are so counterproductive? There is an inconsistency there, and the label of putting all the inconsistencies together is called neoliberalism. And so what I'm trying to understand is the change that we are beginning to see, at least in our country, but I think elsewhere as well, about my sense is, and it's really something to be very hopeful about, that the way that we have been organizing and supervising practices of support over the last 20, 30 years is coming to a close. Neoliberal politics is facing its demise. And the interesting thing is, and that's what I pick up on your micro perspective, the interesting thing is, what makes these initiatives possible? And why are they so important? And my sense is that one of the things that that we haven't been really taken seriously over the last 30 years is that once you start to focus on the individual perspective of people receiving support, there will come a point where you fail to address what they want if you continue to address them as clients and consumers of service provision. That's simply not what they are thinking about themselves. And then you get sort of new kind of logic entering into the whole conversation that creates a fairly strong distance to the official systemic rules and regulations that are still in place. So just anecdotally, in Holland, it's quite strange. We are running a system with a very specific set of tools and instruments and rules and regulations. And if you ask people, even those responsible for having that whole apparatus in place, whether they really believe that it works, it's hard to find somebody who says, yes, I think it works. So this is the juncture of time that we are facing now, and it's interesting to look at what's going on there.
Yeah, I think there's a sense, from my perspective, that a lot of people who've worked hard on inclusion and rights and a variety of kinds of and service systems that have worked around person-centered planning and tried to put the best kinds of quote plans in place and process, have begun to discover that when you try to bring those up to scale, it automatically becomes another system, and you lose the personal touch, and people then systems have a real difficulty responding to individual wants to not be just a person of faith and have my faith respected, but I want to go to that first conservative synagogue down the street and be a member there, and the system says, well, we don't know how to help that happen.
Absolutely.
And so what you find, I think, is a quality of care system and quality of life measures, and a system that says the right things but doesn't know how then to really help that to happen. We say it in universal terms, but to help it happen in the particular is really tough.
It is.
And the paradox and the irony and the beauty, of course, is when you help it happen in the particular, it applies back out to lots of people in different ways. There's all kinds of stuff happening in the Jewish community. Ruti, say something about some of that.
Yeah, okay. I think the thing I'm most excited about in the Jewish community is that there's increasing ordination of rabbis with disabilities who have fought for the right to go to seminary and be accommodated in seminary. Because really, if we want to talk about bringing disability experience into theology, the people who can do that are the people who have their own direct experience with disability, which is not the same as being related to someone. And so I think that there's a lot more emphasis on the people who are in seminary, the people who are being ordained, the people who are leading a disability-led disability discussion, I really like. I found that in congregational schools, there's a lot more interest in inclusion than there used to be, and in day schools, there's a lot more interest in inclusion than there used to be. And there's also a lot more interest in content-based religious education for people with disabilities than there used to be. I feel like the status quo for a very long time was that behaviorists owned special needs. And when it's called special needs, behaviorists own it. And I think behaviorism is fundamentally a rejection of morality. It's fundamentally this idea that people are just made of reinforcement, punishment, and reward, and that justice is just this unscientific thing, and that love is just a conditioned response, and that it's all about behavior and that the mind doesn't matter, which I think is really the opposite of what we're doing here. And so there's all of this stuff that was oriented towards training religious behavior. And there's a lot more now that's about training content and helping people to be able to interpret things on their own terms and teach what they know and be part of the conversation. I think we really need a lot more of that writ large, because it's not just about our needs, it's also about our voices. Because we have things to say that are important and not being heard. And I also think that there's been a shift in the conversation where it used to be more along the lines of, so this is this inspiring thing, aren't we great for like working with those people and their unique special gifts? And I think that we've gotten to a point where there's more discourse around sin and repentance, like we call tshuva, where like we spent centuries excluding people from almost every aspect of society, secular and religious, and that wasn't inevitable. It was a choice we made. It was a sin that we committed and are still, frankly, committing, and we've got so much work to do to repent from that. And I think that that conversation is happening much more than it used to be. Like, wait a minute, we did something wrong, we need to fix it. And wait a minute, our whole society, secular as well, is doing something wrong. Disabled people have been fighting this for a long time. We need to exercise more solidarity. So I'm really excited about those conversations that are happening now as a result of a shift towards recognizing that people have perspectives as well as needs. And one way I put it sometimes is, I'm a little wary of this unique gifts kind of conversation that happens sometimes, because I think that sometimes we don't acknowledge enough what people with disabilities ourselves contribute. The way I see it, like, our capacity to create comes from God, but what we create comes from us. And I think that both parts of that need to be valued for like all people, and I think that's happening more, and I'm excited about it.
Yes, well, there's a couple of things. What I find interesting is the kind of theological shift in the way that disability theology has moved. So, disability theology emerges from disability studies with a particular political agenda, which is really kind of captured in Nancy Easton's book, The Disabled and God, where she takes that liberation theology model. And a lot of the early disability theology focused on some derivation of liberation theology. But the problem with liberation theology, as Hans has written about, is that what do you do once you achieve your goals? What's the theology look like once it's actually the poor are liberated, or whatever you want to frame that? And there's something really interesting in that. So what I've noticed recently is pushing back into what you said, Neil, in relation to a general anthropology that used to be Hansley's, but it's not anymore. So, is it the development of, or the engagement with, if you like, traditional theology, with systematic theology, and with biblical studies around a number of key issues. So Amos Young really began to open up that conversation in relation to systematic theology. The new Baylor series of disability theology books begins to push that again. The new commentary on the Bible that comes out from Baylor has really opened up a whole new fresh space to begin to look at things through a different model. So I've been really fascinated by the theological development, and the way it does seem to be diversifying into a more general anthropology. And just for Madison Young Ben, the movement into missiology, I think, is really important, because Ben Connor's done some fascinating work on missiology and how disability relates to that, and in particular how disability studies can be reread through missiology. So in that sense, Ben's returning to disability study, but looking at it through a different lens. So that kind of theological richness and development, I think, is very important. It's important in practical terms, but it's also important in terms of sustaining the conversation over time.
Over time, what we've tried to do with the Summer Institute is through the plenary speakers we've invited is to have people representing all the different kinds of theological disciplines. To say that disability is not just an issue of pastoral care, or it's not just an issue of religious education, or it's not just an issue of theology, it's an issue of faith history, it's an issue of study of Torah, it's an issue that it involves outreach and social justice, ethics, you name it, homiletics, kind of it relates to all of those issues. It's not going to be, certainly not to be confined to the place we used to put it, which is special ministry. beginning to see a whole lot more pushback by a lot of people to the whole term of special ministers.
Okay. I think another one of, yes to all of that, I'm very excited about it being treated as more normative. And I think one of the, cutting edge things that I'm particularly excited about is the issue of sexuality. Because in Judaism, and I know other faith traditions sometimes see this differently, we see sexuality as a positive thing, and as reproduction and sexuality is a part of continuity, but also as an end in itself. And I've been realizing lately that a lot of the conversation around disability can end up being very desexualized in a way that I think is shifting some when we're talking about, if we're talking about love, there's the love between friends and there's the love that receives, but there's also the love when we're partners and spouses, and when our bodies are treated as having legitimate embodiment, including pleasure, including legitimate expression of sexuality that can be treated as religiously significant and worthwhile and holy. And I think that particularly there's more overlap with the religious LGBTQ Jewish community, which is doing great inclusion work, I've always found that explaining disability issues is much easier when people have this consciousness around gay issues, what it's like to be seen as having no legitimate sexuality, and to claim sanctity for that in a religious context nevertheless. And I think that there's really great conversations happening around that in the Jewish community and writ large, that I think once we can see people with disabilities as having legitimate sexuality, it shifts a lot of other things. It gets rid of the motivation to separate people and put them in institutions so they won't reproduce. It gets rid of the desire to keep people out of education lest they, form, two loving bonds that scare us. And I just think that that's a real shift that I think in significant part due to more disabled people being ordained, due to disabled activists getting more visibility and greater connection with feminist communities and LGBTQ faith communities. I think that's really something with a lot of transformative potential that can go really good places.
I think to go back to Hans's terms earlier about the neoliberal words and the system and the language that we've used, in my experience has been for many years that there were three areas that service systems had the most difficulty talking about, which all involved issues that were both sacred and spiritual in many other ways. And one of them was sexuality, the other was spirituality, and the other was grief and loss and death, end-of-life issues. Those three areas were areas that usual service systems had real trouble struggling with because of kind of a lack of a way to pay attention to the depths of people's lives. Other comments?
At a congregational level, I'm discovering some fun things where ideas that have been brought up in this group over the past 9 years have made their way into congregations. One of them was a church that had a ministry called Belong, and I expected it to be one of these special ministries like you were talking about. But the ministry is actually for people without disabilities to change the atmosphere of the church. So instead of being a ministry that separates people with disabilities and does things for people with disabilities, it's a ministry through which people in the congregation are thinking about how can we make our environment different so that people with disabilities can participate in every aspect of everything that we do. So that was encouraging. Another was a youth group that had a tradition of going to a particular camp for years, and there was a young girl in the program that had physical impairments, and this camp wasn't accessible. And her parents had been working with her for years to prepare her that she's not going to be able to go on this trip with the youth group. And it wasn't the leaders, the adults, or the ordained ministers who made this decision. It was the students who decided that we need to go somewhere else so that this person can be included, even though this place had significance for this group. They had always gone to this same place. It's their older siblings had gone there, their parents had gone there. And so the idea that these young people who've grown up being in school around people with disabilities, clearly this young lady belonged. She was part of the group, and it was the younger people who didn't feel the restraints of tradition and were willing to create new traditions together. So I think making room for young people to contribute to this theological conversation is important because they have perspectives that we need. They've been living into and embodying this different way of being together that some of us are just learning how to do. One last thing is that I'm encouraged that a couple different youth ministry events I've attended have put disability in the center of their conversation. One, a progressive youth ministry conference, which is that sort of has come through the emerging church conversation. I had a conference and allowed me to present disability as an aspect of diversity. So diversity is something that progressive youth ministry is very comfortable talking about. And it was encouraging that they could see that disability fits in as an aspect of human diversity, where it gives you a perspective, a lens on being in the world that can give us insights, different ways that we're going to interpret Scripture because we experience the world in this way, different theological questions that we're going to ask. And then together with John and Billy, we were there as well at Princeton, at their regular forum on youth ministry, decided to do a conference focused on disability issues and brought in people with disabilities as well, of course, to speak on this. And so that's an encouraging trend for me.
I think one of the other things that I've seen over the course of 15 years specifically in the work that I'm involved in currently is this growing network and conversation and relationship that wasn't there or wasn't connected with it 15 years ago, and where this conversation that we've been having here in terms of hospitality and welcome and belonging that is breaking down walls between different faith communities and conversations, and beginning to leverage and engage that dialogue and working much more together in this growing conversation. And I've been personally, more on the practical side of it, have been very encouraged and excited about that growing aspect of this dialogue.
One of the things that, to say something about, I know, Erik, some of the research that you've done with families and others and some of the work that people have done, I think we've had conversations where we've talked to clergy who say more and more have said, yeah, we'd like to do something in this area. We know we should, but we don't know what to do. Or we never had any training in this area, which also relates to Ruti's being excitement of having students with disabilities more increasingly present at seminaries. But what are you hearing from pastors and about their vision about inclusion and the role of the church in relationship to people with disabilities? What are you hearing from John, from the UK, others? Anybody?
I'll start. We did a survey of theological schools 5 years ago, and the degree to which they were addressing disability in their curriculum and the findings were not surprising, but quite disheartening at the virtual silence in theological schools around these issues. So one of the exciting things is seeing now programs like Ben is leading and others that Ben had mentioned, that there's now that topic is penetrating the curriculum, not in a single class, but beginning to embed that training. So I think we'll see more clergy coming out of their training with a posture and an inclination to think about these issues. But when we look on the ground, that's not where we're seeing movements emerging from the clergy down. We're seeing it bubbling up from individuals with disabilities and their families up still. And one of the concerns, absent that vision for what this might look like in their congregation, we're seeing lots of congregations looking to the service systems or to the broader society for models of how to do ministry. So rather than leading and providing a very different vision of how you gather as a community, they're often replicating what they see in schools, in special education, in separate kind of workshops and those sorts of things. So I have this excitement about thinking about cutting edge issues, this excitement about the number of congregations that are saying, we want to do something, what should we do? But some concern that the inclination they have is to design programs that are largely specialized or separate. And that's what we're seeing in the absence of any other alternative is let's repeat what we see in schools. And that is actually a trend that's accelerating, that's not abating. And so I think there's some work there too to draw congregations in, but also say there's a different way that we can gather. And I think part of making that movement is also going to be shifting the conversation and sort of what I would say is the unit of analysis from how is this movement going to be good for our community as a whole versus just how is this good for you as the person who's being included. So a lot of the movements in the special education field and integrated employment fields began with this idea of how can we demonstrate that inclusion is good for people with disabilities? And it didn't change people's inclination to be more inclusive. Until the conversation started to turn to how can we make a compelling case that inclusion is good for the business, for the school, for the larger community as a whole. That's where we're starting to see big movement. So I feel like part of it is also being able to tell good stories about how when we gather in different ways, is the community more faithful, more flourishing, stronger, rather than just something that we're doing for a small segment of the community, which is the posture earlier.
In relation to theological education in the UK, there's two things I think that's worth considering. One, it still tends to be done by people who have an interest in such things. In other words, it's an add-on, so it's tied to the personality of a particular lecturer, tutor, or whatever it is. And so we still see that it's an addition to the curriculum rather than something that's absolutely fundamental to that. So I think that's an important first point. The second point is in relation to ministers. So part of my responsibilities at Aberdeen, I'm Master of Christ's College. So you can all call me Master from here on in. The Christ's College is that aspect of the university and the church that's responsible for training ministers for the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. And so students come through, and almost to a man and to a woman, they are really interested in evangelism, really interested in mission, really interested in families and community building. But when it comes to issues of disability or issues of aging and dementia, for example, they tend to think, it's not really my thing. And the reason for that is that they place it in the wrong category. So one of the areas I'm really interested in is dementia, and in particular advanced dementia. And so the way that students think is they think, well, this is pastoral care. We need to look after these people. And so we place it in the area of pastoral care, and we have a pastoral care that does things, and I go on as a minister and do my own important things. But I think that that's a category mistake, because actually in relation to dementia, just to hold on to that, the real question that they should be thinking about is, how can this disciple of Jesus Christ be enabled to fulfill their vocation even in the midst of the brain damage? So there's no particular reason why somebody who gets a bit of brain damage and stops being a disciple, stops having a vocation. So the question is, how do you sustain someone in the discipleship at that particular moment in time? And that gives the whole question a completely different feel. If I put that to my students, they do actually begin to see something quite differently. So I think that while pastoral care is important, all of us need pastoral care. I think in relation to disabilities issues, it needs to be shifted into a different category. And if we shift it into a different category, then a whole new range of possible options for response and understanding begin to open up.
Yeah, I think that's touching on an important point. I think there is one other aspect of locating the question in the wrong box. and it is for too many people, whether inside or outside the church, despite all sorts of political correct language on the rights of people with disabilities and so on, is that ultimately for many people disability is still connected with defect, which is one of the reasons why it isn't attractive, because it's about defect. And so it seems to me that one of the things in this theological conversation that we haven't been pushing, and we now stand for many people who have been writing, trying to get the theological conversation further with regard to disability, is the notion of creation. And in my own theological work, I've been always particularly interested in cognitive disability, intellectual disability, and particularly profound intellectual disability. And once you start to think about that world of experience, one of the things that's pretty much clear is how strong the notion of the connection between disability and defect, particularly with regard to those persons, is. Theologically, it seems to me that, as is true for many key concepts, by the way, also here the theological tradition is to a large extent responsible for the sources of thinking about defect, and it is that disability would be a consequence of the fall, which the church has always been teaching. Now, suppose you get rid of that, and I think I can safely assume that many people here in this room would be in favor of saying, of course, that's how we think about disability. Persons with disability, they're part of God's creation. But when you actually start to think about what that means, it's a difficult question. Is it truly the case? And if so, what does it mean to say that also a profoundly disabled person is created by God? I'm pretty much sure of two things. I'm sure of the fact that that's what I'm saying, I want to say, and I'm also sure of the fact that if you would press me, explain what it means, I'm not sure that I could provide an answer that makes sense. One of the things that is getting more and more clear to me is that I'm not going to be the person who's going to write that book. So I invite younger colleagues who step in and take on.
Hey. So, responding to the theological point a bit, one of my closest friends is non-speaking and goes in and out of understanding language and has told me a lot of things about that experience. And we share a lot of things cognitively and physically and in how we interact with the world in a lot of ways, even though I understand language more consistently than she does. And she really showed me a lot about how I had not been respecting the humanity of some people as much as I should have. And it's part of what I mean by the disability, like the Torah told me we're all created in God's image. The disability community taught me how to mean it. And, you know, when I was doing hospice chaplaincy and I saw people documented as having no communication, I always made it a priority to document as much possible communication as I could find, because someone being described that way, I think, is a life-threatening situation. And I know that when my friend has been perceived as a non-communicative person, she's faced a lot of life-threatening situations where people tried to deny her treatment. But speaking to what is getting beyond the defect model and what is that? What does that mean? I can give a couple examples of how I've understood disability and not only my experience, but my shared experience of not just being an individual, but being a we in a way that is not the majority. One of them is that, in the Jewish community, one of our traditions is fasting on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And I am, for medical reasons, no longer able to fast. which is, spiritually challenging on a number of levels because everyone says, we're fasting, this is how we do it. Even though everyone agrees that like people who can't do it safely are not only allowed to not fast but are prohibited from fasting, it still feels very isolating. And I was thinking about this on Yom Kippur, and we have like a very long confessional prayer on Yom Kippur where it's like the form is, for all the sins that we have sinned against you by doing like X, Y, and Z broad categories, and it's a collective thing. One of them is ba'ones ubaratzon, willingly and under duress, and another is through eating and drinking. And I realized that for me, drinking water on Yom Kippur is a mitzvah, and that I had been framing it as a sin committed under duress. And I realized how much I'd been seeing my body as forcing me into sin rather than as being in a situation where the way I observe the mitzvot and like serve God is different. And so once I changed that framework and said like, okay, so how do I see myself as included within this normative thing? I realized for me, fasting on Yom Kippur would be a sin through eating and drinking. Then I thought more about my physical experience, I used to be able to fast, so I know what it feels like, sort of this fogginess and this weakness, and I realized that I experience that naturally on a fairly regular basis, like with my current medical stuff. And so maybe that's like such a potentially valuable experience that like people who don't experience it naturally induce it artificially, which totally changed my perspective on a lot of texts that talk about like, if you find yourself ill or disabled or whatever, you should like think about, have you sinned? And I like completely rejected that because I thought of it about punishment. But now that I've been thinking about it, it's like, what is it like to have this kind of embodiment? What can it offer? How can it be valuable? And how do I like bring one way of valuing it into another? Another example of like disability theology is that I'm writing a Haggadah commentary, which is the Jewish like text for Passover. And part of what came out of that was that, Autism Awareness Day, like the most degrading and humiliating day of the year for me and a lot of other people, which is like this annual reminder of how little our lives are valued. Among other reasons, because Autism Speaks, which is the main person driving this, put out a video like years ago where a mother said in front of her child that she thought about driving off George Washington Bridge with her kid in the car, and the only reason she didn't is because she had a normal kid. And her kid was in the frame hearing her say this, and they put this in the video. But anyway, so like World Autism Awareness Day is a very degrading day. And the next day, like a couple days later, was Seder Day, it was Passover. We were going through the Passover Haggadah, and I was by one of my teachers, Rabbi Jen Orbach, for Passover, and she really emphasized the theme in it of from degradation to praise, like going from the dual degradations of slavery and idolatry and exile to praising God in a way that doesn't edit any of that stuff out. And I just realized, like, I understood that in a certain way as a disabled person who has some very difficult experiences with degradation and exile. And it spoke to me, and I spoke back. And I think that we need to have those conversations more broadly and make disability experience more speakable and more seen as something that can be within normativity and in our theological discourse. So I really appreciate this integrated approach that I think we're all bringing.
Okay, you guys have been listening. Some questions coming up, some comments. Let's give you a chance to ask some questions of this group. Anybody got some questions? Come up and pardon? In the back. In the back? Great, man.
So I'm interested in a development that I have gratefully charted through sort of a subtle shift I'm seeing in my work, and I would be intrigued. I've heard a lot of conversation around integrating programs about giving persons with a disability entree into religious conversations. An offshoot of that I would be intrigued to get the panel's thoughts on is in the work that I do, I see a lot of disabled persons of diverse embodiments who want to be in religious vocation but have a desire to not be in an exclusively disabled context. And I know 3 or 4 of them that I work with on an almost weekly basis are in the room. How, both as practitioners of disability theology and the architects of a wider conversation, what does it take to sort of bridge that gap and allow both conversations to flourish and move the dialogue forward?
You all get that? The question was about, the question was about how do we help support and hear, let me make sure I get this right, repeat it, that people with disabilities who feel a call to vocation in religious leadership and faith leadership and don't want to do that just in the context of disability. And would like it to be in a wider context, a more inclusive context. Got that right, Justin? Okay. How do we, what are you seeing and hearing about that?
I can say in my little neck of the woods, what we're trying to do to address that is a number of things. Presence at the seminary, change how we see the presence of people with disabilities at the seminary. So try to make sure that we have funds to hire people with disabilities in leadership positions as professors. Now that changes the perception of everyone who comes to the seminary that people with disabilities can hold leadership positions. And that's not something they're seeing all over, and certainly not in a religious context. Another thing we're trying to do is raise funds so more people with disabilities can participate in theological education. And so that changes the dynamics of the classroom and the kinds of interactions that you have with people with disabilities, and changes, hopefully, your perception going forwards of what's possible. So that's one way that we're trying to address it at the level of theological education, hoping that makes a difference at the congregational level as well.
I think at the congregational level, the challenge for all of us is to make sure people with disabilities have places where they are asked that question about what do you want to do here? Not just how do we serve you, but what do you feel called to do? What do you want? How do you want your gifts to be used in this body, in the people of God? And you've got to be able to see that at every different level, from all those different. It's when people sometimes say, "What's the best way to get people included in a congregation?" And my first response usually is find them a job, something they want to do in that congregation, because then people see people living out their faith and trying to do mitzvah, to be a minister to others in God's name, just as they receive support themselves. Any other comments up here?
So, as somebody who got pushed into a focus on disability out of pretty much sheer necessity because of how much I had to fight for being in seminary and how much of a big fight I had to put up to get access, baseline access needs met, I really feel this question. Because as much as I value the work I'm doing in disability, it's not so great that I was so pushed into it. And I'm really hoping that the current cohort of people who are in seminary have a wider range of options that are seen as legitimate. Because I know that when there are more disabled people in the room, and when I don't have to be the representation, I end up getting to talk about a much broader range of things. Like when I teach on Twitter and it's partial chat and kind of most of my participants are disabled, I get to talk about a much broader range of things. And I think that if we get to the point where there's more of us and we treat accessibility as normative rather than special, and people don't have to fight as much and people don't have to be the one or the first, I think that's a lot of it. Also, if you figure it out, let me know, because I would love to have more options.
Okay. Deeply challenged by Ruti's statement earlier that theology taught her we're being created, or that we're all created in the image of God, and her involvement in disability advocacy is how do we let that out? That's a constant challenge for us as a social service agency. How do we take those things that we talk about and we tell everybody else what they should do, and actually live that out, represented within the work that we do? I wish we were a lot further down the line. We've got a long way to go. There are small inroads that we're beginning to make, where, and one of the challenges for us is we have no business speaking into the church community about being places of belonging and full inclusion and meaningful engagement. If people are walking into our services and support locations and not witnessing them and not seeing that in actuality. And so we're trying to find ways where people that have that they're no longer just recipients of care, but contributors to the entire organization and to the entire work of the organization, not because of their disability, but because they're part of our community. And we're making some small steps in that direction, but we have so much farther to go. That's exactly it. I mean, this is what we believe. This is what we say we believe, but is it really being lived out in what we do?
One of my favorite stories, I don't remember all of it, but there's a guy who really wanted to be more involved in the church, and people started getting him involved. He was a friend with a farmer, and he started getting involved in the church some more. And then he said, I really would like to be a deacon, so he ran for the board of deacons. And in fact, got elected. And then has been a treasured member of that board of deacons, a guy with intellectual and developmental disabilities, because of his capacity to cut through quite a bit of the kind of bureaucracy and sometimes conversations of things that needed to happen, and with some real humor and also some getting right to the core of issues of some of the things going on, to become a valued member then of the congregation because of that. And I think you're beginning to hear more and more stories like that of people of ways that. Now, we're going to move towards the break here in just a minute, but I want to we didn't get to an area which people asked me, Bill, do you set up a theme for the Summer Institutes? And I gave up on that several years ago, partly because I've been to too many conferences where there's a theme, and then the conference content has nothing to do with the theme. We're organized around that, or vice versa. But what kind of has emerged this year, and I love this, emerged out of the grassroots proposals that came to us for workshops, and then as we heard people say about the voices we would like to hear as plenaries. And this year we're going to hear from a number of people from different backgrounds, and this is our biggest collection of white guys on the stage, so they'll be here all week. But this year is going to be in a sense, much more diverse. But the themes that began to emerge were these questions of what's our role as people of faith as advocates in a time in which to stay silent around issues related to people with disabilities in the public sphere may be contributing to their harm rather than to their good. And it's a question and an argument that I've had with people over the course of this year who felt sometimes with me that I shouldn't post something because that's getting into politics, and some of the churches might, part of that network might not like the particular stance that was happening, and yet if it related, for instance, to the repeal of health care last year and to the ACA, I wondered how anybody concerned about the inclusion of people in support of the could not be profoundly concerned about that as people of faith, with the healthcare implications about the basic protection and care of the body before we, anything there. So the kind of what's the role of faith communities in advocacy, and you're going to hear some of our keynoters and plenary speakers address that in a variety of ways. We're starting off tomorrow with Tawara Good, who is a national expert in health disparity and cultural competence, who's coming kind of nervously because he's never spoken to a church group before about this, and trying to say, this is what I hope and you can see about the potential and understand how to have an effective role in this, no matter the particular faith perspective. And then the interesting parallel that came along with this week was then that was not how do we act, but also how do we express truths in new ways, especially through the arts. And so we'll be hearing people talk about storytelling and about dance and about interpretation of biblical stories in different ways and others. And as I've been thinking about this, it's this sort of dance between acting but also reviving the spirit that it helps us to act in the public sphere, and helping to put meaning on the face of advocacy, kind of depth and theological advocacy. So those are the kind of some of the themes in the conversation that we're coming into this week, partly because of you who offered to do workshops, partly because of the way we led to kind of invite different people who from this area or to address particular topics we hadn't addressed before. And I would simply invite you into those conversations. We're going to get started in a half an hour when Tim Shriver arrives, and we'll be kind of bringing a public voice. As head of Special Olympics, he sits in a very public space, and a space that's beginning to say that what they do is much more than about Special Olympics, but is about health and wholeness and inclusion and connection and doing things together in a variety of ways. So we're going to take a 30-minute break. Help me give the hand to the panel. It's a difficult thing to do.